moving on to our committees.
You ready?
I think so this time.
Okay, we'll try.
Harold Cannon, Budget Committee.
Commission, appreciate you letting this be moved to the head of the agenda. One of our staff folks needs to get back to Nashville pretty promptly, and they also need to be here for this. One other comment that I would ask of the commission and in general, and that is the folks who have made us look so good day in and day out or don't get to come in this room. And that's the women and the men who oversee the front desk. And for Region 4, Region 3 that I get to be involved in, but I believe it to be true with every other region. And so if you have a chance today, please tell those folks thank you. The folks here at Region 4 have been remarkable, and it's great to have confidence to direct a call to them. No offense, John, but they probably know more about the regs than the rest of the staff, and that's a real sense of comfort to us when we send the calls there. So do please give them our thanks. As I said a few minutes ago, I appreciate the staff's heart in going through this budget. I appreciate the commission. If anybody says that we're a rubber stamp, they didn't see what all went on this year in evaluating the budget. I have had call after call after call with remarkable questions about the budget that we're going to be considering today. Commissioner Baker called me. I'm driving down the road and he starts rattling off questions, and I'm driving and writing as quick as I can. But it was very obvious that all of you took this seriously. You dove into the details, and for that I'm very grateful, and that's the way it should be. We've really got 4 matters related to the Budget Committee today. The first is just a matter of information, and that is to follow up on a promise that was made back in January, and that is at our September Commission meeting, the morning of the 17th, we will have a called Budget Committee meeting in the main conference room beginning at 9 o'clock. While this is a Budget Committee meeting, this is open to all commissioners. The purpose of this will be twofold. One is the State Treasurer's Office. We're working on getting them scheduled to present to us what our options are on the investment of the endowment funds. And as you're aware, over the past year, I believe we were at 0.07% on interest, generally speaking, not 0.7, 0.07%, although that's begun to increase some, Barry, I believe. And through the efforts of the State Treasurer, we have been given the flexibility to allow them to invest in other arenas, which should help that. Any help would be great on that. So we would have a presentation there. The second is the commitment back in January, and that is we wanted to open it up to the committee, to the commission, to share some of the goals that you would want to see done as far as, are we getting the best return on our investment? Indeed, are there other areas that we should be investing more? If we're willing to cut, we need to be willing to also put money towards other arenas. It's going to be an open discussion. We will be honoring the committee process. There's some things I know Commissioner Ripley is looking into right now that will be discussed at the meeting. So if you would, we'd love to have you at the main conference room September the 17th, 9 a.m., and that will be open to the public. In keeping with the investment of the endowment funds, there's also a resolution that has been put before you that we need to take action on today. Director Carter, would you mind speaking to this, please?
Thank you, Commissioner Cannon. Just a little personal note before we get into the business here. Just a lot of people here that hadn't seen in a while. I just want to say hi and thanks for coming. Billy and I worked together for many years, and he was not only a hunter education instructor, he's also a boating education instructor. And when I was in hunter education, we spent a lot of time together. And then I want to say thanks to Bob Ripley for coming here. Bob worked together with Bob when he was an officer, and then he moved into the regional boating hunter education coordinator, and I was in hunter education and boating education, so we worked through there. And he was regional manager here. So it's been a long career, and really glad to see him back here, and a lot of the other people that I haven't seen in a few days. So thank y'all for coming. pretty much what Commissioner Cannon has talked about in terms of this resolution. The Treasurer Lillard, at the request of Commissioner Cox and Commissioner Cannon and others, had called and asked, is there any way we can do something about the small amount of interest that we receive on our endowment funds and in our reserves? And to fast forward, the Treasurer Lillard came out and met with us on a one-on-one basis, spent about 3 hours going over things that he thought we might be able to do, offered to come forward with legislation during the last legislative session in Nashville, bring that before, and he would carry that legislation for us as opposed to us having to do it as an agency. He did that. It was passed. It allowed him some flexibility that he did not have in the past, and he now has asked that you consider this resolution. I know that you have before you, and with your permission, Commissioner Cannon, I'll only read the last "now therefore it be resolved" part because it is rather lengthy, but essentially what it is saying in a nutshell, I guess, is that we've asked him to do this. We're recognizing his effort and in doing that he's going to change some of the things, or at least offer changes to us on the way we do the investments on those funds that we have now. And he wants to just to make sure that we recognize that there's always a risk in any kind of investment, as there is now in the current risk that we have. He also talks about different options that we can have, and he is willing, or his staff, to come at the next meeting or sometime in between to meet with each commissioner or with the budget committee at your discretion to talk about those different options you have and ask you to make the decision on how you want him to go forward. So this is the first step in that. He just wanted to have the formality of saying the commission recognizes this is what I'm doing, and they recognize that there could be risk as there is with any other investment. So with that, the last paragraph says, now therefore the Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Commission and Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, having considered the provisions contained in Chapter 196 of the 2015 Public Acts codified at Tennessee Code Annotated 9-4-612, and the provisions of the resolution, having consulted with its legal counsel and advisors, and having considered, acknowledged, and understood the risk associated with an investment pursuant to Chapter 196 of the 2015 Public Acts codified in Tennessee Code Annotated 9-4-612, as described in this resolution, by and through its officer or officers have executed this resolution, the Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency is requesting that the state treasurer invest its money pursuant to Chapter 196 of the 2015 Public Acts codified at Tennessee Code Annotated 9-4-612. Be it resolved this 21st day of August 2015. That would be for your consideration, Mr. Chairman.
Director Carter, thank you. Commissioner Cox, I believe you want to speak to this.
I did. I think we're all very pleased to see this resolution. We started talking about this over a year ago, and while it's taken longer than we would like to have it, I would like to express our appreciation to the treasurer and his staff, and to Chris Richardson for his work and liaison between and trying to get this done. I think we'll go from virtually no money to a much better return on the investment. I think the fees that are going to be involved will be, compared to what we will make on are very reasonable. If it says it may deduct, it doesn't even mean that he's going to. I would expect that we will, but I don't. I think that's just what it costs to do business. But, Mr. Chairman, I make a motion we approve the resolution.
I have a motion for approval because the entire commission will be voting on this. Do I have a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion from the commission? Any discussion from the audience? Do we do the budget committee? I have been corrected. The budget committee will vote on this first, then we'll bring it to the full commission. My apologies. Any discussion from the audience? If not, those commissioners on the budget committee, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Now we'll bring it before the full commission. Do I have a motion to accept the budget committee's recommendation? Have a motion, second. Mr. Chairman? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you so much. The last two matters of business to be heard will be heard concurrently. You've been provided a copy of the fiscal year 2016-2017 proposed budget. In that budget manual on page 5, you will see that there is a budget expansion being proposed for fiscal years 2015 and 2016. Staff will be presenting information on that. With respect to the 2016-2017 budget, our hope, my hope, is that we will be able to vote on this today. There's some very brief points I want to make in this. First off is that I believe the budgets were furnished to you last week. The budget that you will be voting on today is indeed the budget and the same numbers that you received in the mail. There are no raises proposed nor allocated for in this, and I would remind both ourselves and the public that we have very limited authority when it comes to raises. Frankly, the commission is responsible for the director's salary only. Any raises go through the administration and not us. And so that is where the control mechanism is there. In the past, we have talked about that there have been some costs that have been statewide costs that are shared with each department or each agency. And we've seen that grow over the years, the cost of doing business, if you will. At this time, we're not aware of any what I would call administrative fees that may be imposed. Therefore, we did not do any allocations with respect to that. Some of you saw the paper this week where the governor has asked all the agencies and directors and commissions to have a plan for cutting costs by 3.5%. This raised some eyebrows, knowing that we have cut to the bone as far as this agency is concerned. At this time, we need to emphasize that this was a request to have a plan. And in fact, our agency has had a plan in its hip pocket for some time to accomplish this. This is not going to be implemented, and there's some question as to whether it would apply to this agency simply because of the way we are funding and that we do not receive any general fund monies. We're going to get clarification on that as well. But the request that's put in the media was only for having a plan, which we indeed have. The last comment, and then Director Carter, I'll turn it over to you. There's a lot of effort that went into forecasting our cash flow needs when we went through the license fee adjustment process. And I can tell you after my review, and David Watson joined us with the presentation of staff, the proposed budget is in good keeping with all the efforts that went into creating the license increase matrix that we established last year. With that, Director Carter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cannon. I'd also like to acknowledge and appreciate the work at the Budget Committee especially, and then those members of the commission who weren't even on the Budget Committee who took the time to not only go through the one that we presented to you or sent for consideration today, but leading up to the last 2 years where we literally have had probably in the neighborhood of 9 separate budget meetings outside of the commission meetings to go over the budget, get things in order, knowing where we wanted to be and setting those limits that you mentioned in terms of where our reserves should be or the rainy day fund, what that should stay at, and the amount of money that we know that we'll be hitting it for over the next 2 years to do some things that you're aware of in terms of communication issues, some building repairs and those kind of things that ordinarily don't come and are one-time projects. So if it suits you, the way I would go through this is I'll start with the expansions to this year's budget, talk about those for a second, then we'll go back and consider the entire budget for the agency and break it out into wildlife and boating, and then at the end of those, I would ask your consideration for the expansions and then on the entire budget. So on page 4 of your budget book, it talks about the expansions to the 15-16 agency budget. You've already passed the 15-16 budget. That's the one that we're currently in. We passed that last year, and what we're asking is some expansions to this current year budget. And you have those items, I think, in front of you, and I'd be glad to go through any one of those that you want to in detail. this whole budget, as you well know, it's pretty lengthy, and it has a lot of moving parts, so to speak, that if one part obviously impacts another, and we broke it out into all the categories I think that you would need for careful consideration from each one of the categories that are in our budget items. But in any case, let me just make a few comments about those, and I won't go through each one of those individually, but I think something that you should be aware of as we go down. I'll start with the Region 1 building security, and as you notice there's a couple of those. All we're trying to do is to bring our buildings into compliance, since there are no security measures in our buildings with the exception of Region 2. But what I wanted to point out, these are of those items that you see, those that have no wildlife money in it, so it will not impact the reserve. So let me just mention those a little bit. The heating and air conditioning units, lead filtration system on an indoor range in near Memphis and Bartlett, 75% of that is federal funded. The Montgomery County range is 100% federal funding. The Uchee shoreline is all outside funding. The Florida, the bear collars is also 100% federal. The NBCI, which is the National Bob White Conservation Initiative, that also is all federal. The Arbor Day seedlings has no state money in it. The native grass is 100% federal. The conserving the snakes on a research project there for a problem we're having statewide throughout the southeast is also federal. The Cheatham the Cheatham National Wild Turkey Federation project is all federal, as is the Wildlife Volunteer Program. So all of those put together in wildlife expansions, it would amount to $798,000 in total. Of that, 3 projects alone, that being the building security and the hatchery raceway, which is to enhance our production qualities for Florida bass. Those 3 alone amount to 237%, or 92% of the state money is tied up in those 3 projects. So the TWRA has $258,000 in license money. There's $490,000 in federal money, and other sources bring in another $49,000 for a total of $798,000 in wildlife. On the boating side, it's one expansion for equipment for boats, motors, and trailers to replace some enforcement boats. Those 2 funds, of course, are separate. Wildlife and boating funds can't be intermingled. So the boating fund would be an expansion of $240,000 for a total expansion to this particular year budget of $1,038,000. So if there are no questions on that, or questions, obviously, whatever you want to do in detail, I'll move into the total budget.
If I may, let me emphasize one point, Director Carter, and that is, from the wildlife expansion side, we had a total of $798,000. Our license dollars amounted to $258,200. Of that $258,000, $237,000, as Director Carter said, was for the Florida Bass Raceway, and then security at 2 of our regional offices. Which is all 3, which are needed. And I think that particularly the Florida Bass Raceway gives us a lot more flexibility than we've had in the past. The difference in that, which is roughly $21,000 to accomplish these other things, is, in my opinion, a great investment of our license dollars. But I did want to emphasize 3 items alone take up a lot of the $258,000 too. Director Carter.
Moving into the total budget preparation for year 16-17, which will be the one that will start in July of 2016. If I could direct your attention to page 1 of the budget book, just make a few comments about that. That's looking at the entire agency budget in total. And I know this is a new process for some of the commissioners who have been on less than a year. So please, if I go too fast, slow me down, but I'm going to hit kind of the highlights. But that on page 1 is looking at the entire agency budget, which has boating and wildlife rolled together. I'm just reminding again that we have to keep those funds separately, and we'll break those out. So I guess the important points to look at on these, and I'll try to make a couple. The column under 14-15 is the year that we just ended in June 30th. It's not 100% ended, and those books in the state won't close really until about January. So, but this is after about the 2nd or 3rd preliminary closing, so it's close. But those funds are not budgeted funds, those are funds that are spent. And that's sometimes a little confusing because we have always historically underspent our budgets. So when you're looking at the columns on the left and you look at the column in the center, it would appear to be a large increase in budget, but you're comparing budgeted funds against money actually spent. In preparation in state budget, we have to prepare it as though every position is filled, every contract is spent, and every program that we have will be spent down to completely 100%. Those things never happen. Even employee services alone, we'll generally have somewhere between $800 and $1 million a year in vacancy savings just because positions as people leave or because we haven't been able to fill them. This year we were about $850,000. Last year we were just over $1 million. So I just make those comments to you because it can be confusing looking at those three columns. And now the next one, which will also get confusing at times, is that those things that we couldn't accomplish in 14-15, whether construction projects or whether they're things that we purchased that were ordered and we have the purchase orders out, but we have not yet paid for because they haven't come in. All of those things are rolled forward into the 15-16 current year budget. So that's why the center budget items are so much larger in terms of total than those in 14-15. It's just that we're taking things that you approved the year before that didn't get finished, moving those into the middle, and that's one of the reasons those budget columns are so much larger than you see. This one on 16-17 is our projected, what we would ask for in 16-17 as a total budget. Another thing to be aware of, and I noticed that it gets a little confusing again, but we talk about ending budgets, and it talks in 14-15, an ending budget of $103,721,000. Throughout the year, we come to you and ask for expansions, just as we did a second ago for this one that we're in. Almost everything we bring you, especially on land consideration and grants, are things that we can't count on to bring to you beforehand, to put them in the budget then, because we either don't know that's going to happen or we haven't received those grants. So we expand the budgets. When this budget was put together in 13-14, and we asked the commission to pass it, at that point, it was $84 million. That's what we asked you to approve. Throughout the year, it went to $103 million, but then when you look what was actually spent, it's only $78 million. So the point I'm trying to make is out of a $103 million budget, we actually only spent $78 million. And that holds true through all those that we go, as we go forward. If you could turn to page 2 for a second. Pages 2 and 3 are the wildlife and boating budgets broke out separately. The first one, the wildlife budget, and I'll just make a couple of comments on it. Again, the first column, 14-15, is what we spent in the wildlife side of the agency for 14-15. The center column are those things that we're rolling forward from that year into this year. And it also includes those expansions that we just asked you for. We're not being presumptive, but because that you would pass them, but in order to be able to consider what the total budget was, we put those in, and any of them obviously that you consider not going forward with, we could remove out. But those expansions are in the middle. The expansions that a little bit of difference between last year and this year, of the about $9 million difference, over about $6 million of that is in land purchases, and all of that is 100% funds. So that difference of $8 million that was in last year into this year, again, over $5 million of it is 100% federal funds tied up in land production or land acquisition, and a couple of other items that are no licensed dollars involved in. So, as I said, I could go into a lot more detail, and certainly will at your discretion, but what we're looking for there is a budget going into 16-17 of $70,819,000. And on the boating side, if I can switch to 3 for a second, page 3, very similar in the way it's laid out. That is 14-15 being actual expenditures, 15-16 current year budget with things rolled forward, and then 16-17 of those things that we're asking for in the following year. I'll go back just 1 second to page 1 to point out under funding sources what some of those things mean, because I know it can be a little bit confusing. the license registration that's money that's utilized for the things above that come out of license sales and boat registrations. That's essentially what all that's talking about. The reserve is the amount of money that's coming out of the reserve or the rainy day fund to help fund the projects. It's not the ending balance. So I just want to point that out because that can be confusing. The other categories are different things that we've received money for one reason or another and that help pay for those programs, and we can go into those details if you want to do that as well. So a very quick overview would leave me with asking you to approve expansions in the 15-16 budget of $798,000 in wildlife, $240,000 in boating, for a total of $1,038,000 to the current 15-16 budget.
Director Carter, thank you. I'm going to ask you to expound a little bit on a couple of subjects that
Okay.
were pretty consistent with the questions that were passed on to us. With respect to the expansion that we're considering for 2015-2016, there was a question about our boat fleet, that we're upgrading that. We're changing the type of boats that we are using. It's an expensive price tag, but you have also shared that the return on investment is significantly greater by us taking this approach than what we've done in the past. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on that?
Traditionally, what we've done is just send out a bid and say we need to replace. We'll give the style of boats, and we have about 3 different lengths that we generally buy. And we'll say, these are the boats that we would like to replace. These are the equipment that we find necessary to be on those boats. We send that out, and we get recreational boats that we get, and then we try to change those into an enforcement model. So when we get those boats, then we have to buy the blue lights, the sirens, the radio equipment, and things that go with that. Under the boats that we're moving toward now are actually built by Boston Whaler for this particular one. They're the ones that are on general services contract, which means that contract price is set for both the federal government and the state government. It won't go up or it won't go down. So there's no bid process. If that's the boat you're going to get, that's the one you'll utilize because the bidding's been done by the federal and state government at a higher level for all agencies involved. So when we go to those, we'll get those kind of boats are specifically set up for enforcement. They have reconstructed beams on the T-tops. They come with the blue lights and sirens already on them, so that's an expense we won't have to go forward with to retrofit those. They also come with marine radios, and they have special things like built-in large rub rails all the way around the side for not only for docking, but as you're checking boats. So long story short, they're built for enforcement as opposed to taking a recreational boat and trying to convert it.
The second matter is that, would you mind going through the procurement process for equipment and some of the budgets? There seem to be a pretty good difference in pricing. Could you share with us how that will work as far as the actual procurement?
On anything that we buy, we go through the same process as all the other state agencies. That is, we put out, depending on the amount of the purchase, and the state has lower limits, we don't have to bid out. For instance, if we're going to go buy 10 buckets of paint, we can handle that through a different thing. There are still things you have to go through, and if it's on contract and on. But we'll put out the bid for whatever those things are. We generally, unless there's some unusual reason, it always goes to the lowest bidder. And when we're putting our budgets together so that we have an idea of what those costs will be, our procurement folks inside our agency look at what those expenses were for the last year or the last 2 or 3 years and tell our folks, if you're going to budget for a tractor, you're going to budget for a grader, a boat, whatever it happens to be, this is what it cost you last year. Expect it to cost at least that or maybe 4% more. So we take those and go forward. Now, sometimes, and we noticed in the budget ourselves that some of the same equipment items have different costs with them. I know there's some mowers in there that were different costs, and it didn't go into an explanation on one might be a greater horsepower or not. But in any case, that's the process we go through. We send it out for bid, and then we take those bidders, go with the lowest bid, and go forward with it. In terms of any money that might be left over, for instance, if a person puts in their budget, we're going to buy an item and it's $10,000, and it comes in at $8,000, that money would still be in the budget and literally could be used for something else with the approval of the supervisors. I'll just point out to you that there's no advantage to coming in with something over budget, because each division and each region has a guideline. So when they come in, they're fixed. So they can juggle the things around inside their budget for their projects as they need to do. But if a person puts $10,000 in a mower and it's really only $8,000, then they're taking $2,000 away from something else in that budget, because it all stays contained. So there's no incentive to come in with something higher than it actually costs. So I hope that made sense.
Mr. Chairman, keep me straight on this, but I think the appropriate steps, I want to take this in bites, and that is, I'd like to entertain a motion for the 2015-2016 budget expansion. Upon receiving a second to that, assuming we have a second to that, then we'll open it up for discussion across the board. Do I have a motion? Second. Okay. Is there any discussion regarding the 2015-2016 budget expansion by the committee? Any discussion from the public? Hearing none, all in favor of, on the committee sides of approving this, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. We'll now take it to the full commission. Do I have a motion? I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Public or the commission? If none, with respect to the 2015-2016 budget expansion, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We're now on to the matter of the proposed 2016-2017 budget.